Unichunje we. Sema.
Tupa bati hapa ya kwanza.
Okay.
Pole.
Hapa ni pa 3 metre.
Hapa ni pa 3. Mabati ya kwanza 3 metre.
20.
Kwa 20.
Pale mnafikia ni pa combien?
4 metre. Pole. 4 metre donc hapa hii
vile njoo kuingia.
Unaona vile ni wengi hapa.
Niko naona.
Niangaze ule ayulu. Unaona vile wengi hapa. Ndio vile tunaingia.
Ushinyangushie bulongo.
Kama unafika pale, pale anashuka na wewe utuangalie kama
shuka naona.
Mweke.
Cobalt tunaweka ndani. Huyu tunamweka. Geuka angalia hapo.
Naanza funga nini?
Mwache vile tunapanda. Kama hata vile anapanda ina.
Ndio hata kiloko.
Okay.
Sike vile njoo kukata.
Ekipeki kata maiwe. Ekipeki kata maiwe. Wewe ni buchafu.
Ule ni buchafu eh?
Rodini ule anaanza.
wewe mapumbu.
Wewe molo. Sunjika. Shiba krezere tunikala.
Njoo nipi hao?
Hii ni product.
Sasa kumko ule nikala kumkongo hapo na yeye ni nani?
Papa Josué.
Mbili.
Ndio.
Sasa hii masaka mnaekea nini hapo?
Hii ni grave ya produit.
Ni ya produit eh?
Ndio kwa sasa salon.
Ndio tunatosha hii ndio kunaangusha maiwe mateneri.
Kuinza kumatiki nini?
There are various different ways in which men, women and children mine cobalt in southern DRC. In many cases, they literally dig out tunnels and mines by hand. They dig deep underground. One of the miners told us that the mine that he dug was 50 meters deep, that it took him 15 minutes to get from the bottom all the way up to the top. They use the most basic tools, hammers and mallets to chip away at the rock. They load up their sacks and then they pull them up they call up to their mates at the top and they pull them up by rope. These mines are extremely dangerous because these miners aren't getting any support from the government. They don't have technical training. There aren't supports within these mines. Accidents are common. And the miners also don't have protective equipment. For example, inhaling cobalt dust can be extremely dangerous. It can cause a fatal lung disease called hard metal lung disease. Anyone working with cobalt in the West, in the US or other parts of the world, would have proper face masks to prevent them from breathing in this dust. In these mines, they don't have any masks at all, so they're exposed to these dangers day in, day out. Fatalities are common, the miners told us, and also, from what we've picked up from media reports, we know that in this bit of southern DRC, it's an area which used to be called Katanga, that over the past year there have been at least 80 fatalities in these mines. But we also spoke to people who said that many accidents aren't reported, and bodies are just left buried underground. So no one has a figure of the true number of fatalities in these mining accidents. We were able to identify at least 7 steps in this supply chain. It starts with the miners. They work for themselves or for other miners, maybe wealthier miners or the landowner. After the mining, they fill up their sacks and then they put them on the back of cars or motorbikes and they take them to a market called Masompo. This is a market for minerals outside of the city of Kolwezi. They take them to this market where there are dozens of individual trading houses owned by primarily Chinese businessmen and women, independent Chinese businessmen and women who own these trading houses. From there, these businessmen and women sell to bigger companies, which then process and export the cobalt ore. We found that a lot of this, if not most of it, goes to China, where it is then processed further and then sold on to lithium-ion battery component makers. They sell to lithium-ion battery makers, who then sell them on to the companies which make our mobile phones, our laptops, our cameras and other electronic goods. The primary use of cobalt is in these lithium-ion batteries. These are the batteries that we all have at the back of our phone, these rechargeable batteries. In most parts of the world, there are no laws obliging companies to conduct this human rights due diligence on their mineral supply chains. In some countries there are. For example, in the United States, these companies are obliged to publicly report on the steps they take to trace certain minerals which come from the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo. These are sometimes called conflict minerals. The point of this law, which was brought in a couple of years ago, was to make sure that the trade in these minerals, which also go into people's mobile phones, don't fund the conflict in the east of the DRC. There are no laws regarding cobalt or other minerals which are mined in the DRC or elsewhere in the world and are also associated with human rights abuses. So one of the things that Amnesty International would like to see is for countries, not just the US, but countries around the world and the European Union, for example, to oblige companies to conduct this human rights due diligence on the raw materials that go into their products. And we'd also like the US to expand that list of minerals away from just these so-called conflict minerals to include other minerals, including cobalt. I think a lot of people do want to know where the raw materials and the minerals which go into the products that they buy come from. They want to know that the clothes they buy aren't made in abusive and dangerous factories around the world. They want to know that their iPhone or their smartphones don't contain minerals which are being mined by children. I think a lot of companies accept this. They publicly make statements that they do know where their raw materials come from, and they take active steps to ensure that they're ethically sourced. What our research reveals is that despite what these companies say, they're not actually doing it in practice. They're letting cobalt, which could have been mined in these appalling conditions, into their products, and they haven't taken the steps to prevent that. Many of the companies that we contacted replied and said, it is far too complex to trace the cobalt, that they didn't know whether it had come from the DRC or not. Our response is simple. More than half of the world's cobalt comes from the DRC. The conditions in the mines there that we've documented have been documented by other organizations. For many years, the US Department of Labor has published a list of goods that is produced by child labor, and it is named cobalt ore from the DRC. It's had that on its list for several years now. So these companies have absolutely no excuse for not doing their best effort to trace where the cobalt comes from. Now, we're not saying that's easy, but we're saying that these companies with multi-billion pounds worth of profits and turnover should be making more effort than they are at the moment. The simple answer is that if Amnesty International can do it, they can do it. The main finding is that there's a high risk that cobalt, which has been mined by children or by adults in extremely hazardous conditions in the Democratic Republic of Congo, has ended up in the smartphones, computers and other gadgets of many of the world's leading companies. Well, we think that companies have a responsibility to know where the raw materials in their products come from. And in cases like this, where we have identified human rights abuses, where they should be also able to identify human rights abuses, they need to be part of the solution. They need to be part of efforts to, for example, take children out of the mines and help them go to school. We believe that companies have a responsibility to ensure that they aren't in any way profiting from human rights abuses. In this case, we've documented that there are human rights abuses in these mines. So it's wrong for companies to use cobalt from these mines without trying to do anything to improve conditions in those mines. And it's simply not good enough for these companies to say the supply chain's too complicated, or this problem is happening in another country, another part of the world, it's got nothing to do with us. In this day and age, it does have something to do with them, and it's got something to do with us, the consumers, as well. The United Nations, which is based in the DRC, says that there are at least 40,000 children working in these artisanal mines in the southern part of the country. How many are working on cobalt as opposed to other minerals, we don't know, but it's clearly a very large problem. From the children who we spoke to, the issue here is simply one of poverty. They're forced into these mines because their parents don't have jobs and can't afford the school fees. And we met children who started mining at the age of 7, at that young age.